Wild animals don't approach humans unless something is very wrong. While on his routine patrol, Ranger Elias Thorne encountered something strange. A gaunt mother bobcat stepped from the trees with a fragile kitten dangling from her jaws. Elias expected the bobcat to flee or become aggressive, but instead, she fixed her gaze on him and deliberately stepped into his path. Then she turned, paused, and looked back again. Elias realized she was trying to lead him somewhere. Drawn by instinct, he followed her deep into the woods. What Elias discovered that day wasn't just a rescue, it was something darker. This is what happens when a wild bobcat asks a human for help, and what happens when he answers the call. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning light broke over the Bitterroot Mountains with a brilliance that stung the eyes, a piercing diamond dust clarity that only deep winter in Montana could produce. The air was not just cold, it was absolute. A stillness so profound that the snapping of a frozen pine bough sounded like a rifle shot echoing through the valley. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of his cabin, a steaming mug of black coffee cradled in his calloused hands. At 72, Elias was much like the landscape around him, weathered, sturdy, and accustomed to silence. Since Martha had passed 5 years ago, the silence had moved from the background of his life to the foreground, becoming a companion rather than an emptiness. He adjusted his wool cap, took a sip of the bitter coffee, and watched his breath plume into the frigid air. It was a good day for a patrol. Elias wasn't a ranger anymore. He had retired from the service over a decade ago. But old habits died hard. He still walked the perimeter of his 40 acres, checking the fence lines, clearing fallen branches from the trails, and simply bearing witness to the forest he loved. He went inside, grabbed his heavy canvas pack, checked his first aid kit, a habit ingrained from 40 years of pulling hikers out of ravines, and strapped on his snowshoes. The hike began with the rhythmic crunch of aluminum teeth biting into the hard-packed crust of the snow. The forest was a cathedral of white and green. Towering ponderosa pines wore heavy coats of snow, their branches bowing in silent reverence. Elias moved with a steady, practiced gait, his mind wandering to the mundane tasks of the week. The woodpile that needed restocking, the generator that was coughing a bit on startup. The letter to his daughter in Seattle he still hadn't finished writing. He was about 2 miles from the cabin near the edge of the old logging road that nature was slowly reclaiming when the stillness broke. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling. The prickling on the back of his neck that told him he was being watched. He stopped, planting his poles in the snow, and scanned the tree line. The forest was dense here, a tangle of shadow and light. Then he saw her. She was standing on a fallen log about 30 yards away, motionless against the backdrop of snow. A bobcat. But she wasn't the ghostly, elusive shadow one usually glimpsed for a fleeting second before it melted into the brush. She stood exposed, her posture rigid and unnatural. Elias narrowed his eyes. Even from this distance, he could see she was in poor condition. Her coat, usually a thick, mottled tapestry of tawny fur and black spots, looked dull and matted. Her ribs were faintly visible beneath the winter fluff, speaking of a hard season and scarce game. But it was what she held in her jaws that made Elias's heart stumble in his chest. Dangling limply from her mouth was a kitten. It was a tiny thing, no bigger than a grapefruit, its fur fluffed against the cold, its eyes squeezed shut. It hung by the scruff, passive, trusting, or perhaps too weak to struggle. "Easy, girl," Elias whispered, though she couldn't hear him. He expected her to bolt. A mother cat with young is usually the most paranoid creature in the woods, vanishing at the snap of a twig. She didn't bolt. Instead, she locked eyes with him. Her eyes were wide, pools of desperate amber, burning with an intensity that unsettled him. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped off the log and moved toward him. Elias stiffened. Rabies? Injury? Wild animals didn't approach humans unless something was terribly wrong. He gripped his hiking pole a little tighter, not as a weapon, but as a barrier. The bobcat stopped 10 feet away. She lowered her head and adjusted her grip on the kitten, letting out a low, muffled sound. A chuffing noise that sounded almost like a sob. She turned her head, looking back the way she had come, toward a dense thicket of spruce and alder. Then she looked back at Elias. She took a few steps toward the thicket, stopped, and looked back again. The behavior was unmistakable. It was the same look his old border collie Buster used to give him when Timmy fell down the well or a calf was stuck in the mud. "Follow me." "You want me to follow?" Elias asked aloud, his voice raspy in the cold air. The cat took another few steps, her gaze fixed on him, pleading. She was trembling, he realized, not just from the cold, but from an adrenaline-fueled exhaustion. Elias looked at the sun, high and bright, then back at the cat. This went against every rule of wildlife safety he knew. You don't follow predators into the brush. You don't interfere. But the look in those amber eyes tore through his logic. It was a look of absolute terrifying desperation. "All right," he muttered, adjusting his pack. "All right, Mama, I'm coming." The snow was deeper off the trail. Elias struggled to keep up as the bobcat weaved through the undergrowth. She moved with a fluid grace despite her emaciation, but she paused every few yards to ensure he was still behind her. The kitten in her mouth swung gently, a silent pendulum marking their urgency. They walked for 20 minutes, moving deeper into a ravine where the shadows stretched long and blue. The air grew colder here, the sun blocked by the steep walls of the gully. Finally, the mother stopped near the base of a massive ancient cedar tree, its roots creating a natural hollow that was relatively free of snow. She gently set the kitten she was carrying down on a bed of dry pine needles. The little one let out a mewl, barely audible, and tried to curl into a ball. But the mother didn't settle. She turned immediately to the base of the tree, pacing frantically back and forth, letting out sharp, high-pitched cries. Elias approached slowly, the snow crunching loudly in the confined space. He peered into the gloom beneath the cedar boughs. There, half buried in the snow, was a second kitten. This one was awake, its eyes wide with terror and pain. It was thrashing weakly, its small body contorted. Elias stepped closer, squinting, and then he saw the glint of oxidized metal. A trap, an old, illegal leg-hold trap, likely set by a poacher years ago and forgotten, or perhaps set recently by someone with no regard for the law or the season. The jagged steel jaws had snapped shut on the kitten's right foreleg. "Oh, little one," Elias breathed, a wave of nausea rolling over him. The sight was horrific. The snow around the trap was stained pink. The kitten had clearly been fighting it for hours, maybe days. It was exhausted, shivering violently, its energy reserves depleted. The mother bobcat looked at Elias, then at the trapped kitten. She moved to the trapped baby and began to lick its face, her tongue rasping over the fur, trying to offer comfort where there was only agony. She looked back at Elias, and then, in a move that broke his heart, she stepped toward him and nudged his shin with her head. It was a breach of worlds. A wild predator, an apex hunter, reducing herself to a beggar, touching a human in a plea for salvation. She was surrendering her instincts to her love. Elias dropped to his knees in the snow, unbuckling his pack with trembling fingers. "Okay," he said, his voice shaking. "Okay, Mama. I see it. I see it. I'm going to help." He had to be careful. A mother's protective instinct could override her desperation in a split second. If he hurt the kitten while trying to free it, she might attack. "I need you to give me space," he said softly, looking at the mother. She seemed to understand the tone, if not the words. She backed away a few feet, sitting down next to the first kitten, watching him with an intensity that burned. Elias took a thick wool blanket from his pack. He moved slowly, telegraphing every action. He approached the trapped kitten. The little thing hissed, a tiny, defiant sound, and tried to bite. I know," Elias soothed. "It hurts. I'm sorry." He gently draped the blanket over the kitten's head and body, effectively blinding it and calming it down, while also protecting his own hands from needle-sharp teeth. He felt the leg. It was bad. The bone wasn't severed, thank God, but the tissue damage was severe. The metal was cold and rusted, the spring mechanism stiff. He needed leverage. He pulled out his multi-tool and a small pry bar he carried for ice. He positioned his knees in the snow to stabilize himself. "This is going to hurt for a second, little guy," he whispered. He gripped the trap's jaws. The springs were heavy-duty, meant for a coyote or a wolf, far too powerful for a 3-pound kitten. Elias gritted his teeth and pushed. His old shoulders screamed in protest. The metal groaned. The kitten screamed under the blanket, a high, piercing shriek that made the mother Bobcat leap to her feet. "Stay back," Elias barked, not looking up, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing air. "I'm almost there." He put all his weight into the pry bar, wedging it between the jaws. With a metallic clack, the trap sprang open. Elias moved fast. He scooped the kitten up, keeping it wrapped in the blanket, and pulled it away from the rusty jaws of the machine. He sat back in the snow, cradling the bundle, breathing hard. The mother rushed forward. She didn't look at Elias. She went straight to the blanket bundle, sniffing frantically. Elias slowly peeled back the wool. The kitten was limp now, likely in shock. The leg was swollen and bleeding sluggishly, the fur matted with dried blood and ice. "He's free," Elias told her, "but he's in a bad way." He knew he couldn't leave them here. The kitten needed warmth, antibiotics, and fluids immediately. If left in this ravine, infection or hypothermia would kill it before the sun went down. Elias looked at the mother. "I can't fix this here. I have to take him." He reached into his pack and pulled out his emergency bivy sack, a reflective, insulated bag. He wrapped the injured kitten in a spare fleece sweater and placed it inside the bivy to retain body heat. Then, he looked at the healthy kitten, the one the mother had carried. It was shivering too. "You too," he muttered. He picked up the second kitten. It was lighter than air, just fluff and bones. He tucked it into the front of his heavy parka, zipping it up halfway so only its head poked out, resting against his chest. The mother watched him, confused. She paced, chuffing. "Come on," Elias said, standing up, the injured kitten cradled in his arms, the other against his heart. "We're going to my place. It's warm there." He started walking back the way they came. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. The hike back was grueling. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving Elias's joints aching and his lungs burning. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long purple shadows across the snow. The temperature was plummeting. Every time he stopped to catch his breath, he saw her. She was always there, 10 paces behind, a silent gray ghost in the snow. She didn't approach, but she didn't lag. She was guarding her family. When the cabin finally came into view, smoke curling lazily from the chimney, Elias felt a wave of relief so profound he almost wept. He stomped up the steps and kicked the snow off his boots. He couldn't bring the mother inside. That would be too much stress for a wild animal. But he had the woodshed. It was attached to the side of the cabin, fully enclosed, dry, and piled high with seasoned oak. It wasn't heated, but it was out of the wind. He opened the shed door and cleared a space on a workbench. He laid down an old sleeping bag. He took the healthy kitten from his jacket and placed it on the bag. Then he placed the injured one next to it. He backed out, leaving the door wide open. He stood 20 feet away and waited. The mother bobcat emerged from the tree line. She approached the cabin cautiously, sniffing the air. She smelled the wood smoke, the man, and her kittens. She slunk into the shed. Elias watched as she reunited with them, grooming their faces, purring so loudly he could hear it from where he stood. "I'll be right back," he whispered. He went inside the cabin and went into overdrive. He grabbed a bowl, a syringe from his first aid supplies, a bottle of saline solution, and a can of tuna, the only meat he had that wasn't frozen solid. He also grabbed a handful of antibiotics he had left over from when his dog had an infection the previous year. It was a gamble, but he knew the dosage. He returned to the shed. The mother hissed when he entered, arching her back. "I know. I'm sorry," he said, keeping his eyes averted to show submission. "I bring food, medicine." He set the tuna down. The smell hit the starving cat instantly. Her hunger overrode her fear. She began to eat, ravenous, gulping down the fish. While she ate, Elias worked on the kitten. He flushed the wound with saline. The kitten barely moved, too weak to fight. He crushed a quarter of an antibiotic pill into a paste with water and used the syringe to squirt it into the kitten's mouth. He did the same with some sugar water for energy. He inspected the leg again. No broken bones that he could feel, but severe soft tissue damage. It would heal, but there would likely be a scar, a limp. "You're a fighter," Elias whispered. He stepped back. The mother finished the tuna and immediately returned to her babies. She curled around them, her body heat a furnace against the cold. Elias closed the shed door, leaving it unlatched just enough so she could push it open if she panicked, but closed enough to keep the wind out. He went into his cabin, sat in his armchair, and stared at the fire. He didn't sleep that night. Every hour, he went to the window and looked out at the shed. It was quiet. For the next 3 days, a strange routine formed. Elias would go out in the morning with food, raw chicken he had thawed, more tuna, fresh water. The mother, whom he had mentally named Shadow, would retreat to the top of the woodpile, watching him with wary eyes while he tended to the kittens. He cleaned the injured kitten's leg twice a day. He fed them small bits of meat. The healthy kitten, Scout grew bolder, batting at Elias's shoelaces. The injured one, Trapper, slept mostly, his body knitting itself back together. On the fourth morning, the change happened. Elias opened the shed door, carrying a bowl of water. Shadow didn't retreat to the woodpile. She sat on the sleeping bag, her kittens nursing. She watched him enter. She didn't hiss. She didn't growl. She blinked slowly. It was a cat kiss, a sign of trust. Elias froze. He blinked back. "Morning, Mama," he said softly. He set the water down. She stood up, stretched, and walked over to him. She sniffed his hand, her whiskers tickling his skin. Then she rubbed her cheek against his knuckles. The contact was electric. Her fur was coarse, her body solid warmth. It was a bridge across millions of years of evolution, a suspension of the natural order. For a moment, they weren't man and beast. They were just two parents, two guardians, acknowledging a shared victory against death. "You're welcome," Elias choked out, tears suddenly pricking his eyes. He thought of Martha. She would have loved this. She would have been right here on the floor with them. By the end of the week, the weather broke. The temperature rose, and the sun began to melt the hard crust of the snow. Trapper was limping, but he was walking. The infection was gone, the wound scabbing over nicely. Elias knew it was time. He couldn't keep them. They were wild. If they stayed too long, they would lose their fear, their edge. They would become dependent, and in this country, a dependent animal was a dead animal. He opened the shed door wide and propped it open. He stopped bringing food. He sat on his porch and watched. It took them an hour to leave. Shadow emerged first, sniffing the melting air. She looked back into the darkness of the shed and chuffed. Scout tumbled out, chasing a snowflake. Trapper followed, favoring his right leg, but moving with determination. They played in the snow in front of the cabin for a while, a chaotic tumble of fur and claws. Elias watched, memorizing the scene, the way the light caught their spots, the way the mother sat stoically, guarding them, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath for them. Then, Shadow made a low, guttural sound. The playing stopped. The kittens fell in line behind her. She walked toward the tree line. At the edge of the forest, she stopped. She turned around. She looked at the cabin. She looked at Elias, sitting on the porch with his mug of coffee. She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent transmission of something ancient and profound. There was no debt between them, only a shared memory of survival. She turned and vanished into the trees. The kittens followed, small shadows swallowed by the great green expanse. The cabin felt emptier that night than it had in years. The silence returned, but it felt different now. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of peace. 2 months passed. Winter gave way to a muddy, raucous spring. The creek swelled, the wildflowers pushed through the rot of leaves, and the birds returned in a riot of song. Elias was busy. The roof needed patching, and the garden needed turning. He thought of the cats often, wondering if Trapper's leg had held up, if they had survived the late February blizzards. One morning in early April, Elias was chopping wood. The rhythm of the axe was meditative. Swing, crack, stack. Swing, crack, stack. He stopped to wipe the sweat from his brow. The birds had suddenly gone quiet. He turned toward the forest edge, instinctively checking for a bear or a cougar. There, sitting on the large stump of an old oak tree about 50 yards away, was a bobcat. She was sleek now, her coat vibrant and thick, the russet and black patterns striking against the new green of the underbrush. She looked healthy, powerful, the queen of her domain. Beside her sat two younger cats. They were nearly half her size now, lanky and awkward in their adolescence. One of them sat perfectly still. The other was grooming its right front leg. Elias lowered the axe. He stood frozen, his heart hammering a joyful rhythm against his ribs. The mother cat stared at him. She didn't approach. She didn't need to. This wasn't a plea for help. It was a visit, a check-in. She let out a sound, not a cry of distress this time, but a sharp, clear yowl that echoed through the clearing. I am here. We are here. The kitten with the bad leg, Trapper, stood up. He walked along the log, sure-footed and strong. He looked at the man who had held him when he was broken, his ears twitching. Elias raised a hand in a silent wave. The mother bobcat dipped her head, a motion that looked for all the world like a nod. Then, with a fluid, liquid movement, she dropped off the log and into the brush. The kittens followed, disappearing like smoke in the wind. Elias stood there for a long time, the axe resting by his foot, a smile stretching across his face that made him look 10 years younger. The silence of the forest rushed back in, but he didn't mind it anymore. He wasn't alone. He was part of it all, woven into the wild tapestry, connected by a secret kept between a man and a beast. He picked up the axe and swung it again. Crack! The sound rang out, not as a disruption, but as a heartbeat in the living woods. The seasons turned, and years rolled on. Elias grew slower, his hikes shorter. But every winter, when the snow lay deep and the silence pressed in, he would watch the tree line. And sometimes, on the coldest, clearest mornings, he would find tracks near the woodshed, large prints flanked by smaller ones. He never saw them again, but he didn't need to. The tracks were enough. They were a promise kept, a circle unbroken, a reminder that in the harsh, indifferent beauty of the wild, kindness was the one force that could leave a mark deeper than any scar.